to me. You are my strength, strength like no other, strength like no other reaches me.
Happy Sabbath, everyone. I am delighted to have you to come back with us this afternoon as we continue to shine a spotlight on Nevis and St. Kitts. We had an awesome start this morning. Pastor Josiah did an incredible job of delivering the word of God. And everyone, so we got a little spotlight. Alexia gave us a little spotlight about Nevis and St. Kitts this morning, and we're going to continue that now. So I want to first have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to invite Alexia to come back on, and then she will introduce the other guests. So please bow your heads with me. Father God, I thank you. I thank you for this day. I thank you for what we're doing all month long. The different spotlights we're shining on the various countries as we expand our horizons, not just looking at the struggle that African Americans have had here in the United States, but the struggle that all of our people have had across the globe, wherever we come from. And now bless us as we talk about, as we look at Nevis and St. Kitts and learn about the particular things and the people from there. Bless us, guide us, and keep us is my prayer. In Jesus' name I ask it. For his sake, I pray. Amen. My friend Alexia was born and raised. And so there's no better person for me to throw it to than Alexi. Lexi?
All righty, good afternoon.
Okay, but there you go. Looking like you came from Nevis or St. Kitts.
All righty,
Awesome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here to tell you a little bit more about the history in St. Kitts and Nevis, and I'm joined by Sister Kerri and her family, and she will introduce more about them a bit later. But my focus would be first to talk about just some overall history of St. Kitts and Nevis and to kind of talk about the history of Adventism in the country. And then Sister Kerri will focus on her grandfather, a well-known Adventist pioneer, J.H. Lawrence. So we're excited to share that with you today. First, I'm just going to share my presentation with you, and then we'll continue. Alrighty. Okay, so I am going to share with you a historical perspective about St. Kitts and Nevis. And as I talked about this morning, I kind of did just a quick overview, but I wanted to continue that. And so my focus this afternoon would be just a brief overview of colonial history. We'll talk about history after colonialism, and then that kind of period after colonialism, and then independence. And then I want to also focus on our church history. So, as I mentioned, these islands are in the northeastern Caribbean. They were first inhabited by the indigenous Indians, the Arawaks and Caribs, and then they were visited by Columbus in 1493, and they were settled by the Spanish, and then the first British settlement was established in 1623, and St. Kitts and Nevis were a power base for the British after that time. So during colonial times, the islands kind of switched between the French, Spanish, and the British. For the most part, they were mostly occupied by the British. There were some small wars that where maybe those islands were seized, but then they were returned in treaties to the British. Again, these islands were a huge part of the British Empire, where they made huge profits from the production of tobacco, cotton, and sugar that were cultivated by enslaved African people. So during that time, slavery continued until it was outlawed in 1834, and the formerly enslaved Africans, after that point, had to fight for economic freedom and citizenship rights during that time. I did want to highlight here that one of the reasons why these islands were highly sought after was the geographical location, and of course, because of King Sugar. So here we see a fortress that's a Brimstone Hill in St. Kitts. This is one of the largest forts in the Caribbean. It took 100 years to complete, and it was built by and maintained by an enslaved people. And this was one of the places where the British launched like all their, their efforts to capture or keep other islands in the Caribbean. So in the late, let's say 1700s, 1800s, St. Kitts became one of the most sought after islands because of the booming sugar industry, and it was, again, because of its prime military location. After slavery was outlawed, there were 8,015 slaves that were freed in Nevis and 19,780 that were freed in St. Kitts. Now, these enslaved people there was a period after 1834 where I said 1884, but it should be 1834. But during that time, 4 years after that, the enslaved people, formerly enslaved people at that point, had to work for their former enslavers, but they were actually paid during that period, which was called an apprenticeship period. Now, after that period, we saw a decline in the sugar industry and in those cash crops, and because, of course, there was no longer free labor, there was not a lot of, there was a huge drop in profits, and so there was declining interest from colonial powers to remain in the region, or to at least contribute to upkeep in the region. Now, just want to take note here that the islands are so small that they were often kind of grouped together based on geographical location. So St. Kitts Nevis was also federated with Anguilla in 1888. And so they were considered one country. And so during that time, these countries were suffering from neglect. Again, because there's not a lot of political will to invest in the populations there. There was an increase in social unrest due to the lack of opportunity, poor wages, disenfranchisement, and then also because of the decline in the quality of life. Now, this also led to the rising labor movements and trade unions because most of the people who were affected during these times were unrepresented in government. They were poor and they were disenfranchised. So as a result, we had a lot of social unrest there. And so this resulted in the rise of labor movements where we had leaders who were invested in empowering the poor, underrepresented, or workers, the working class, who were subject to very challenging working conditions, but were not being compensated fairly. Particularly, there were several strikes and riots in the 1930s. Of course, that's also around the Great Depression. So there was a lot of unrest there. And so what rose from that were the labor movements and the trade unions. In particular, there were the St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla Labor Party that arose from that, which essentially we had people organizing, trade unionists organizing to not only empower the working class, but to also fight for political and economic freedom and also political freedom for those countries. And so this kind of provides the context for the march to, I guess, self-governance and then towards independence. And that's the context for where the national heroes come about. I forgot to, to preface this at the beginning by saying I am not a history expert. I am just someone who's trying to learn more about our history and willing to share what I've learned so far. So, as I mentioned, St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla were one, I guess, country, and they were under colonial rule, so they could not determine their own government or their own constitutions. But again, with the help of labor unionist, political activists in the islands, they jockeyed towards or they negotiated towards more independence. So they were granted associated statehood for St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla in 1967. So essentially what associated statehood, and this was also several other countries as well, kind of negotiated this same arrangement. And essentially, this was an act in the UK Parliament that allowed these countries to have their own self-governance, but in terms of defense and external affairs, those were handled by the United Kingdom. So this was the context that kind of leads to the 5 individuals that I'm going to be talking about who are considered national heroes. Many of these individuals were, in some cases, started out as workers in the sugar industry who themselves experienced again the frustrations of working, being underpaid, and they took leadership in those ranks to make a difference. In particular, we'll see that many of the early leaders of the country rose from those movements. Also, I want to note that the growth in the labor unions in those areas resulted in political parties, in particular the St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla Labor Party that eventually became the St. Kitts Labor Party, right? So that kind of gives you the context of where we'll be talking about. So I wanted to go into more detail about the national heroes and why, and this context kind of explains to you why they are considered like founding fathers for our young country. So as we talked about, after associated statehood in 1967, political leaders in St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla worked towards, well, I didn't mention this part, but after associated statehood, the countries could make a determination about what they wanted to do since they could have their own constitutions. Anguilla decided to secede from St. Kitts and Nevis, and they, because they wanted to be more self-determined, and they decided that they wanted to establish their own connections with United Kingdom directly. So they decided to become British protectorates. In St. Kitts and Nevis, they stayed together, although there were some differences in terms of, I guess, leadership. There were some kind of maybe frictions around who would be considered leaders, or the treatment of people in different islands, the leadership style that was employed by some of the political leaders. There were some friction around that, but the countries remained a federation, and they worked together towards independence, and that involved negotiating with the United Kingdom about their self-determination and what would be required of them to be allowed to strike out as independent countries. Now, with that said, independence was realized on September 19th, 1983. And that meant, again, the country was now able to determine its own and make its own political decisions and be independent. Now, in 1998, the parliament decided to honor national heroes based on their contributions that they gave. I talked about this a little bit more this morning. So I wanted to talk about the national heroes in more depth. And so our first national hero is Sir Robert Llewellyn Bradshaw, and he was born in 1916, and he died in 1978. He was actually the country's first premier after associated statehood, and he was a labor rights leader, and he is considered the father of independence. He also helped to negotiate the takeover of the sugar industry and nationalized former estate lands so that they could be used for public good. They have several monuments, including the airport, named in his honor, and he was the inaugural national hero. Our next person, our next national hero, is Sir Paul Southwell, and he was born in 1913 and died in 1979. But coincidentally, he was born in Dominica, but he adopted St. Kitts and Nevis as his home. He was the second premier and the first chief minister of St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, it was interesting to note that how he ended up in St. Kitts and Nevis was because he was a police officer in the Leeward Islands police force. So as I mentioned, post-colonialism, all the countries were grouped together and they shared defense and government operations. And so he was a police officer in that, and then he moved to St. Kitts where he worked in the sugar industry and eventually became a trade unionist. He helped to pioneer the economic diversification beyond sugar in St. Kitts, and there's an industrial park named in his honor. He was also honored as a national hero in 2004 to mark the 21st anniversary of independence. Our third national hero was Sir Joseph N. France, and he was born in 1907 in Nevis, and he died in 1997. He was a former social services minister, and he was also a trade unionist as well. He participated in the delegation that went to give evidence about the poor conditions in the former British colonies, and that delegation also sought to fight for better conditions. He also fought for universal suffrage in the country for free and fair elections. Prior to 1952, voting was only restricted to property owners and colonists, and the upper class and the working class was left underrepresented. So they fought for universal suffrage, which was enacted in 1952. The hospital in St. Kitts and Nevis, the J.N. France Hospital, was named in his honor, and he was also awarded the Order of the National Hero in 2004. Our fourth national hero is Sir Simeon Daniel. He was born in 1934, and he died in 2012 on the island of Nevis. He was a former teacher and lawyer. He was the first premier of Nevis, and he was appointed to this position upon independence. Now, Sir Daniel was part of the Nevis Reformation Party, and there was the attempt to kind of make sure that there was equal representation in Nevis. So through the negotiations in preparation for independence, he helped to frame the Constitution so that there was a provision included so that there could be local government in Nevis, and so that led to the formation of the Nevis Island Administration, and that set up where there is a government in Nevis, and then that's a Nevis Island Administration, and then there's the federal parliament that has representation for both St. Kitts and Nevis. And this was his vision was also instrumental in transforming the economy of Nevis, so that we can get to with more reliable public utilities and infrastructure, better education, including universal preschool and free tertiary education. He also has helped to establish the Bank of Nevis Limited in 1985. He was honored as a national hero in 2013. Our final national hero is Dr. Kennedy Simmons. He was born in 1936, and he is the only living national hero. He was a medical doctor by training, and he studied at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and he completed residencies in the Bahamas and in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was appointed premier of St. Kitts and Nevis in the 1980s once his party won the election there, but then upon independence, he was appointed as the country's first prime minister. He helped to lead our country into independence and beyond. And as I mentioned, he's our only living national hero, and he was awarded this honor in 2015. So again, you can see these individuals were instrumental in helping transitioning our country toward the goal of an equitable society that represents the people. Just a note about the current demographics of St. Kitts and Nevis. I won't go into too much details, just mainly looking at our population, which is about 52,441, and just some political information here. I do want to move on to discuss the history of the Adventist Church. Unfortunately, not a lot of it is documented, but the overall picture is this. In the Caribbean, a lot of the Advent message was spread through literature and the work of Bible workers and literature evangelists. And so some of the first literature evangelists and missionaries came to the Caribbean in the 1880s. And we had the first SDA conference came about in 1903, where we had the Jamaica Conference and the East Caribbean Conference established. One pioneering missionary to St. Kitts and Nevis was Wilbert Ford in the I think that should be the early 1900s. Now, I do want to highlight, again, there are different, people who pioneered the message in St. Kitts and Nevis. Another evangelist who was well known was Dexter A. Ball, who was a traveling evangelist. He was quite noted for his work in Barbados and some of the other larger islands, but he also visited smaller islands like St. Kitts in 1891. Now, in terms of notable missionaries, we have Elder James A. Morrow and his wife, who, let's say, really opened St. Kitts to the gospel in 1899. He was from Iowa, and he's pictured here on the right, and he was known for his gentle Christian influence. Now, in terms of the churches back then, we had like small groups of Sabbath keepers who were like in the different islands. But we would say that during that time, in the like early 1900s, St. Kitts and Nevis were part of the Leeward Island Mission, and then, that was established in 1926, and then in 1976, when the North Caribbean Conference was established, it became a part of that, and then it is now a part of the South Leeward Conference, which was established in 2019, along with Antigua, Barbuda, and Montserrat. Now, all these different conferences in the Caribbean are part of the Caribbean Union, which is a part of the Inter-American Division of Seventh-day Adventists. Just want to give some historical context here, thinking about where the message was in the early 1900s. This is a village of St. Kitts that I was able to find in a book that provided a glimpse of the mission work in the Caribbean in the early 1900s. Now, I wanted to talk about Adventism in Nevis, because that's where I'm from. And I also, my home church there is the first established Adventist church on Nevis, and it's called the Manning's Seventh-day Adventist Church. So in the early 1900s, based on the book Glimpses of the Caribbean, the Advent Message in the Sunny Caribbean, they noted that there were isolated Sabbath keepers in Nevis, so there was not an organized congregation. But we had a Nevisian who went abroad and returned. Her name is Rachel Griffin, and she shared she learned about the three angels message when she was in the US. And she came home and began a small congregation with her husband, Elihu Griffin, who happens to be my great-grandfather. And so they established a congregation starting in the 1920s. Some quick facts: the first baptized member was Amelia Maynard, and the small company began in a neighbor's home, and then they moved to a small hut on another member's property. Unfortunately, the established churches like the Anglican Church and some other churches, there were squabbles about members. And so unfortunately, the church structure that was built was burned down. And then the church had to meet in the head elder Elihu Griffin's, where he worked at the Great House at Eden Brown, which was a former plantation. And so they were able to meet there for a while. But then again, because of some, discord with other established religions, they had to find their own church because they had issues like not being able to bury their dead because people didn't want the Adventist church there. So, but they persisted, and they were eventually able to purchase their own property, and they named their church the Phoenix because it arose out of the ashes of the former building. Well, not the former building, but the fact that their property was burned down and they were able to rise again. The church is not necessarily known by that. It's more commonly known as the Manning's SDA Church. And so this is a picture of the newer buildings that were built in the 80s and renovated in the 2000s. So the first church that was established was dedicated in 1928. There was a period in 1931 to 1932 where all the men left the church. I was not quite sure. I'm not quite aware of why. The longest serving elder was John Sutton. The first couple to be married was Miriam Small and Waldy Maynard. The first baby to be blessed was Florence Maynard. And the first resident minister was Pastor Samuel Joseph. And the Manning's Progressive Pathfinder Club, which is my Pathfinder Club, was established in 1969, and it's still going today. Just some current church demographics so that out of that one branch church that Sister Rachel and Brother Elihu created, we now have 5 congregations in Nevis. We have 2 districts, District 2, Mannings and Beulah, and in District 1, we have Gingerland, Brown Hill, and Charlestown. And there are 2 Pathfinder clubs, one in each district, and the membership is about 750 and counting. Our pastors are Pastor Delroy Josiah and Pastor Otis Brown. Pastor Josiah shared the message this morning. And then in St. Kitts, we have 9 congregations and 1 Spanish congregation. And there are 3 districts and about a total membership of 1,710 people. And they're served by, they have 6 different Pathfinder clubs. So you can see there's a strong culture of the Pathfinder club in our country. And in St. Kitts, they're served by 3 pastors, Pastor Stanton Adams, Theodore Smith, and Lyndon Elliott. In addition, our church has an Adventist primary school, a health, food, or bookstore, and a dental clinic in St. Kitts. So yes, and just in time, my time is up. And so I just wanted to share our colors with you there. So, all right, so I will now hand this over to Sister Kerri.
All right, thank you, Lexi. And actually, I'm going to kind of pick up where you left off. One thing that I'd like to do to introduce my segment, I recognized as I was doing research that these things, this message in St. Kitts would not be possible without allies that actually had positive relationships with those of a different race. And I wanted to mention 2 in particular, and then keep listening out for how they're going to interact with this particular story. Let me share the screen. And the first name I am going to share is Albert Hazemer. Now, Albert Hazemer was a missionary sent to Jamaica. He wanted to go to Jamaica in 1893. And he became the superintendent of the New West Indies Mission. The General Conference oversaw missions, so they appointed him. But what he would do is take the ferry shuttles to various islands. And so he went to Puerto Rico, he went to St. Kitts, he went to Trinidad, St. Vincent, Antigua, and St. Thomas. His wife, another interesting fact I thought, his wife was the pastor who conducted the services at home while he was away. This is 1893. The efforts prospered, and by 1903, as you said, the Jamaica Mission became the Jamaica Conference, and the East Caribbean Conference was also formed with Hazemer as the president. He returned in 1905 to the United States, and he became president of the Alabama Conference and was on the board of the newly formed Oakwood Manual Training School, opened for Black students in 1896. Keep those in mind. The second one, well, we'll talk about the Haskells in just a little bit, but I just wanted to start with that. And then my segment, I've entitled A Legacy of Faith, since our theme is We've Come This Far by Faith for our Black History Month. And Walking in Your Purpose, and also Black Stories Matter. And you're going to hear a Black story this afternoon. I wanted to start because of who I am outlining. There's no way I could start without scripture. And so I thought the one that kind of epitomized his journey is John 14:11 through 16. And I would like for you all to read it with me. At home, read it with me. And it says, "Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Otherwise, believe because the work of the works themselves. Truly, truly, I say to you, He who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also. And greater works than these he will do, because I go to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, that will I do, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it does not see him or know him, but you know him, because he abides with you and will be in you. The person that I am highlighting this afternoon is Joseph Hermanos Lawrence, and I have seen in some of the resources that I've looked that he actually had another middle name, which I'm familiar with because it came to my father, which is Warrington. But we knew him as J.H. Lawrence. And he had the injunction to tell the world about his faith and his belief in God. Over the decades, Joseph Hermanos Warrington Lawrence represented his native island of St. Kitts, which means that he is a Kittitian, which is what you're called from St. Kitts, as one of the most successful pioneering Adventist evangelists. He preached across the southern states where Jim Crow practices prevailed and in areas that had never witnessed the Seventh-day Adventist message. He labored for more than 60 years as a lecturer, pastor, church builder, and leading supporter of Adventist Christian education. He baptized hundreds of people, purchased and or built dozens of churches, and continued to serve after his retirement until his death at the age of 102. On the sun-kissed island of St. Kitts in the capital of Basseterre, Joseph H.W. Lawrence saw the first light of day on January 8, 1885. He later became a naturalized citizen of the United States, but continued to hold fond memories of his birthplace in the Leeward Islands, which were then part of the British West Indies. His parents, Joseph Daniel and Mary Magdalene Carty Lawrence, were members of the Moravian Church, which, interesting fact, encouraged teaching the reading and understanding of the Bible to anyone who desired, regardless of their race or designation. That was not a common stance by the churches pre or post slavery in the area. Joseph lost his father as a young child. His father had gone to work on building the Panama Canal to support his family, but died in Panama. I'm suspecting that it had to do with the same malaria outbreak that everybody else was dying from when they were there in Panama. His mother then married Samuel David Carlisle, and the surviving siblings included twins Mabel and Myra Carlisle and brother Cyril C. Carlisle. By the way, Myra Carlisle Landsmark's daughter, Marjorie, was the pianist for our service this morning. Joseph attended the Basseterre Moravian Primary School. His stepfather, Samuel Carlisle, was the principal of the Episcopal Intermediate School. When he was 8 years old, Joseph first heard the Seventh-day Adventist message and was deeply impressed. Judging by the timeline you mentioned, Lexi, it was probably Dexter Ball that he may have heard. He didn't remember the name. His mother, however, was bitterly opposed to his acceptance of the message. His deep convictions, though, were not easily dismissed. By age 11, he had vowed to the Lord to keep all of God's commandments, even though his mother would hide his shoes or other clothing to prevent him from attending church. At age 15, he again decided to be baptized on Easter Sabbath of 1900. But his mother locked his clothes up in the closet and telling him, "I'm protecting you until you're old enough to think straight." And he couldn't go to that baptism. At the next opportunity, in May of 1900, he was successfully baptized by Elder A.J. Hazemer. He then was expelled from the Episcopal Intermediate School and forbidden to teach at any school or talk of his newfound faith. Now, what I do need to mention is that he, as a teenager, not only went to the Episcopal Intermediate School, but he taught math as a teenager because he just was good that way. And his stepfather recognized that he was able to handle it. And he also taught at the Basseterre Anglican Primary School. But when he joined the church, his stepfather fired him, expelled him, and he could not make a living that way. He was encouraged to try a different direction, even though his family and many people in the community expressed very strong disapproval of his decision to become a Seventh-day Adventist. But he held on firmly. Elder L.A. Spring, who had come from Grand Junction, Colorado, to pastor the St. Kitts Seventh-day Adventist Church, learned of Lawrence's problem and contacted the Dorcas Society, we call it community service now, back in Grand Junction for help. He was encouraged by Elder Hazemer to continue his education by attending that Seventh-day Adventist school in the United States, recently opened to educate Black students. 8 ladies back in Grand Junction responded to the call, and they pooled their resources to provide funds for Joseph to come to America and attend Oakwood Manual Training School, now Oakwood University, in Huntsville, Alabama. Before he left St. Kitts, he also engaged in call porter work, we call that literature evangelism now, under Elder S.A. Wellman. On March 25th, 1903, on his way to the school in Alabama, Joseph arrived in New York City and stayed briefly with Elder Stephen N. Haskell. Now, Elder Haskell's story is a interesting rabbit hole to go down in itself. At one point in time, for instance, he was the president of 3 conferences at the same time, 2 in New England, 1 in California. I don't know how that happened. But he was determined also to encourage an outreach in the cities. So he bought property a couple of blocks from Central Park in Manhattan and opened a training school where the evangelism was teaching people about health and health education and teaching them about the Bible. And I thought that interesting, looking at what J.H. Lawrence ended up doing. I'm positive that there was some influence there in recognizing the value of what they did. The next, after J.H. arrived, the next day, Mrs. Haskell prepared a big lunch for him, gave him $2, and sent him on his way, on his journey to Oakwood by train. After 3 days of train travel, he arrived in Huntsville at midnight. Well, there was nobody there to meet him when he arrived, except a party of robbers who promptly relieved him of his $2. So he arrived to campus penniless. He recalled that he was the first foreign student to attend Oakwood. Without adequate funds to pay for his board and tuition, he had to figure out navigate his way, so he worked teaching other students. He also received funds every month from that Dorcas Society back in Colorado, who had never met him, but they sent monthly sent money for him. And interestingly enough, in those days, Oakwood suffered from a teacher shortage, especially in the field of mathematics. They needed somebody to teach algebra, and since Joseph had the knowledge and the skill, he was asked to teach while he was attending the college. In 1904, while he was at the Oakwood Training School, according to one author, he witnessed Ellen White's speech to the students about preparing themselves to serve in the African American communities across the American South. Ellen White also had a specific conversation with him regarding a particular relationship that he was beginning to forge. which she warned against, and fortunately he heeded that advice. Joseph's formal training and teaching were brief. And I am going to go to this section just to remind you of how some of these allies were assisting in Joseph's future. He was baptized by A.J. Hazemer. He got financial help from L.A. Spring and the church members in Colorado. He did literature evangelism with Elder S.A. Wellman. Elder and Mrs. Haskell helped him out in New York. He was advised by Ellen White. And now he is going to be working with Ellen White's son, Edson, in Mississippi. He was asked by Elder F.R. Rogers, who was also working with Edson White, on the Morning Star. And if you've not heard the story of the Morning Star, this was really the beginning of evangelism for the Black people in the South. Edson White was determined to do that. Ellen White financially supported him. And he did get pushback from a lot of quarters in the North, but he pushed on anyway. When Joseph arrived in Mississippi, Frank Warnick, a leading Black minister, welcomed him, and another fellow minister, Elder W.H. Sebastian, served as a district advisor to the Black preachers. So he got the mentoring that he needed, even though he only had that 1 year at Oakwood. As pay, he earned $5 a week when he got that. One source indicated that Ellen White and some of her friends occasionally paid his salary. But Joseph was undaunted as he taught school during the week and preached at both Sabbath and Sunday night services. He remembered that in those trying times, even one good meal a week was hard to come by. Lima beans, cornbread, and dried apples were among food items sent by Northern Adventists who would supply food and clothing to his endeavor. After his initial and short tenure at Yazoo City, Mississippi, he returned to Oakwood Training School, where he met and married Bella Brandon, a daughter of the prominent Brandon family, who actually still live near Huntsville to this day. Bella's brother was one of the leading builders of the Oakwood School buildings. The night after their marriage, the newlyweds left for Jackson, Mississippi, where Joseph preached and taught in a building built by Edson White. Because of his wife's failing health, Joseph returned to Oakwood and tried to persuade her to remain with her family while he went back to Mississippi to finish a major tent effort. And that was actually one of the primary sources for evangelism in those days. People would pitch a tent and invite the neighborhood to come in. We still are not exactly sure who this woman is. I'm suspecting she was a Bible worker at the time of this tent meeting. Bella was determined to stay by his side, though, for better or for worse. They next went to Birmingham, Alabama, where their endeavors flourished. Evangelist Lawrence erected a giant tent in the city of Mobile, Alabama. He worked with Elder Sidney Scott, who taught him much about tent evangelism. He was afforded an evangelistic assistant, Elder George E. Peters. Who went on to launch his own outstanding evangelistic and pastoral career of his own. The work was growing rapidly, but the financial strain and the working conditions were hard. During the evangelistic series in Mobile, his wife Bella succumbed to her illness. It was a stunning blow, but Joseph leaned on his Lord for strength. He continued preaching and conducting a very successful evangelistic campaign and many campaigns in the years to come. Eventually, he married the former Geneva Wilson in 2010, and 2010 was also a banner year for he was ordained to the gospel ministry that year. Geneva was the parent or the mother of his 6 children. They are Hermanos, Genevieve, Jocelyn, Dorothea, May Elois, and Cardi. At this time, I am going to pass the baton to my cousin Janice Adams, Dr. Janice Adams, and she is going to share with us some of the information. She is the only one of us that officially got to interview J.H. Lawrence. So welcome, Janice.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me and welcoming me here. It's not usual that I get to speak about the person. Kerri has been very good about saying Joseph. I'm saying, who is she talking about? Because I'm thinking about my Uncle Hermie. So that's who I'm going to refer to so that I don't keep slipping up on it. J. Hermanos Lawrence, who we call Uncle Hermie. And indeed, I did get to interview him and in 1976, my grandmother got a call. My grandmother is kind of on the younger spectrum of his sisters, and I don't know, Kerri, unfortunately I couldn't sign on earlier, but did you speak about the family? Okay, so my grandmother was more known as one of the twins. She and her twin sister Mabel were born in November of 1891, and so I am their daughter. But my grandmother, he was close to from afar, and she got a phone call from him one Saturday morning that literally said, "Sister, I'm dying." And of course she went into, trauma. And I happened to be there. At that time, I was an NPR correspondent, for those of you who know National Public Radio, and I was with them, and we were launching the New York Bureau at the time, and I was the reporter launching that bureau, and I was in town for the weekend, and staying with my mother and grandmother when they got that call. And so I said to her, well, if you want to go, I'm going to go home to Massachusetts where my husband and children were at the time. And I said, I will come back on Monday and we will fly out to Washington and spend time with Uncle Hermie, and then we will travel down to Oakland and spend time with her sister Jenny and her brother-in-law. And that's exactly what we did. It was a wonderful trip that ended up being fortuitous, because when we got there, he was just fine. What had happened was that he had indigestion. But it was so good that happened, because within 6 months, my grandmother was gone. And so she really considered kind of the trip of a lifetime that she got to go. And when we got there, he just rolled out every possible grace for us, because with half his family in New York, he so very rarely got to see that part of his family. So my grandmother was there for herself, and she was kind of an ambassador for his other family who were still on the East Coast. For those of you who are familiar with New York, for this part of the story, I will say that it is quite something that my granduncle lived in Bellevue, Washington, and in New York, we have a different Bellevue, and it means quite something else. It means what would then have been called the crazy house. And I have enjoyed that, because when we got to Uncle Hermie, you will understand what I mean. It wasn't quite a crazy house, but it was rather creative. And we got in the car. He was going to take us to show us around town. And we got in the car, and his wife, Mrs. Lawrence, who was an absolutely stunning woman, and she got in the car, and the first thing she did was to take down the mirror on the passenger, the flap on the passenger side where she had this huge mirror. And I said, this is a very beautiful woman. She didn't appear to be this kind of vanity. And then I realized what the mirror was for. And what the mirror was for is that his job was to drive straight ahead, and her job was to look in the mirror and say, a little to the right, dear, a little to the left, a little to the left, dear, a little to the right. And that was how the two of them made their way around town in Washington. My grandmother and I were just, are we going to survive this? And we did, thank goodness. But it was not without losing a few pounds in just, complete shock that this is what was going on. But when we got back home, we got word that the police chief of Bellevue had come to pay a social call on my Uncle Hermie. And he came, bib and tucker, all his brass and, everything else, cap under his arm and his deputy by his side. And he said, "Dear Reverend Lawrence, as a venerated member of this community, don't worry about having to drive yourself anywhere. My deputy will take you any place you need to go." And my understanding is that is how they finally got, I think at that point, 100-year-old Uncle Hermie off, no, maybe a little younger, but not that much younger, off the road. But I love that story, not only because it's fun, but because it really goes to the state of mind of the man, the perseverance of the man, the tenacity of him, the creativity. And that is something, you talk to people who are in 50 and they look at someone who's 70 and they say, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. Well, here we had an elder in the church, but an elder in the family, and he had, as in the African-American tradition, it is said, made a way out of no way through so many things in his life. And that's what I want to talk about. I love the humor of the man, which is obviously how he survived to be to the age that he did survive to, but also, how he made it through. Because I was in radio and television at the time, I traveled nowhere without a tape recorder, a little reel to reel. And when I got to California, I asked Uncle Hermie if I could interview him. And it turned out, and I did not know this at the time, but many years later, I met Reverend R. Stephen Norman, who is prominent in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he is an archivist as well. And around 1999, I got this out of nowhere, and I do not have it scanned to my computer, otherwise I would show it to you now, but picture of my Uncle Hermie as a radio broadcaster. And who knew that I was following in his footsteps with my own radio and television shows, just as he had his own radio show. And interestingly, that is not what he told me when we were with him, even though he knew exactly what I was doing. He was more interested in the little time that we had in kind of preparing me for what he felt would be some of the next steps. He told me about his experience being the first foreign student to Oakwood College. I had been among the first 4 African-American students to desegregate as an 8-year-old the New York City public schools to end school desegregation. And so he looked at that through that lens and spoke to me from that standpoint. I had gone through college, obviously, and then graduate school, and he was talking to me about what my next stages would be. What I asked him was what it meant to be this first foreign student. What was it like to be at Oakwood in Huntsville, Alabama, not only at the height of segregation, but I would say at the depths of depravity of American society. And I'm a very straightforward person about that kind of thing, and especially with what they put African Americans through. And so when I asked him about how he got through that, he said, "Always sleep with one eye open, daughter." And obviously, I'm wondering, what is he talking about? And then he explained to me what it was like to be in that environment. He also spoke about how he literally had to sleep with a pistol under his pillow because he never knew what crazy person was going to wreak what kind of havoc at any moment. It is important to remember that at that period of time, the Seventh-day Adventist congregation was considered a cult by these upstanding religious and right people who were willing to lynch other people. But they looked down on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so he was under siege at every moment of the day as an African-American, African-Caribbean American man. He was under siege because he was a dark-skinned African-Caribbean American man. He was under siege because of his faith. And that must be said and must be told because, when I went with my grandmother, as I said, we then continued down to his sister and brother-in-law. But his sister and brother-in-law and he were really quite close. And my Uncle Cyril, who was Janet's husband, Cyril Lucas, the two of them really had an interesting relationship because they were both firsts in their congregations. Uncle Hermy, as you know, obviously, a first in terms of the outreach to African Americans and being an African American pastor and all of that. Uncle Cyril had been a plantation organizer. He had to flee for his life to the United States in the middle of the night. And he arrived in the United States, worked every menial job, became an attorney, and then became a Lutheran minister. And I asked him, "Uncle Cyril, why did you change over from the law?" He said, "Because I wanted to save them before I had to defend them." So between those two men, they really had quite a relationship. They understood each other. They knew what they had each gone through. Uncle Cyril as a plantation organizer, Uncle Hermy as an organizer really for the church, building congregations. And my understanding is to this day, he still holds the record for having started more congregations than anybody else in the church. And so that was what we spoke about. And one of the things that they both wanted me to know about their collective experience was something that has since become one of my most important speeches: know when to leave the plantation. And it was a statement that was from Uncle Cyril as the plantation organizer, but picked up by Uncle Hermie as someone who had lived, through that plantation era South and had to measure his steps and had to know what the signs were, the kind of signals around him that said it was time to leave that plantation. But also the two of them shared, and that's what I share in my speeches, with that know when to leave the plantation, that it was time, even then, it was time for America to leave the plantation, even more so now. And so I got to share that with him. I asked him about his relationship back home. Did he ever tell anybody, his mother in particular, what it was really like? And he said that when he first tried to tell her what the United States was really like for Black people, she didn't believe him. At that point, the mythology was totally, land of opportunity, streets paved in gold, and, all of that kind of thing. And that Black people were the problem. That was what the United States is still very efficient as passing along, a lie that is very widely spread. Black folks are the problem, not whites, not racism, but Black folks are the problem. And so she accused him of being too American and saying that if he wanted to go along with this, it was clear an American meant Black in the most negative sense of the word, that he did not want to work, and that was why he was saying these things. And of course, he did try to explain to her. Many years later, he sold his share of the family land, not for this reason, but he did bring her here. And having brought her here in the 1930s, then she certainly had an opportunity to see for herself what the United States really was about for Black people. But at the same point, it still represented hope for so many others. The mythology, the promise of America represented hope. And so he also told me that one of the reasons that he could not, after a while, tell people the truth, that he realized from his mother's response that he had the hopes of the entire island, he said, resting on his shoulders. He talked about those people who had come out and given money so that he could make that journey to the United States. They saw in him their own hope for a better day and a better future. And he said that he just at a certain point stopped saying anything because he recognized what he represented for them and to them, and that was more important than anything else. I asked him, what he wanted me to kind of know and carry forward. And obviously he stressed the fact that he was a vegetarian, and that was important. I was raised Episcopalian. He wanted me to know about his barefoot conversion, as it is referred to. I was down in the islands. I was invited by the government of St. Kitts to come down to St. Kitts because they wanted me to write something, which I did. I wrote an article called Going Home that appeared in Essence to talk about my pilgrimage to my ancestral home. And he in going there, he actually, honestly, I quickly lost my spot, but I'll come back to it. In going to St. Kitts, I remember what it was. they they showed me a book about the history of St. Kitts, and on the very first page was this story of Hermanos Lawrence walking barefoot in the town because his mother hid his shoes to prevent him from going to the wrong church on the wrong day. In his determination, as he wrote in a letter to the family from the time he was 8 years old, that he would move on from the Moravian church and the Episcopal church, that he knew that he would be a Seventh-day Adventist person at 8 years old. But I found it astounding that that story of this young, proper West Indian man of a proper West Indian family, and a relatively privileged West Indian African American, well, I should say Afro-Caribbean American family, walking barefoot in the streets of St. Kitts to get to his church. But on that trip, I also was taken by the government to our family seat, if you could call it that. And it was the church and school and home that he'd been raised in when, after his father died on working on the Panama Canal, which so many blacks of that time were conscripted to work on the Panama Canal as though it was still the era of slavery. And his father died on that work, and his stepfather is the one who was the teacher who then taught from that church, that home, that school. And as we were going through the kind of ruins of the house, I found a nail that was a hand-hewed nail that was clearly at least a century old. And I brought it home for my mother and my grandmother and got to share that with them, that I had actually been to that place that had been so formative for my grandmother and her entire family, and for my uncle Hermie, J. Hermanos Lawrence. So I'll end there. And if anybody has any questions, if I could answer, I will.
Okay, and I think it's going to take a minute or two to for anybody to process. So if you do have some questions for Dr. Janice, make sure that you either put them in the chat or make sure that you know the process, most of you, so that they can be shared with her. That those fascinating vignettes into the life of J.H. Lawrence. Actually, there's so much that we can talk about, and this is not going to be enough time to really complete everything that we were talking about. But I did want to share in light of some of the things that Janice, that you said. There was a story Elder Charles Bradford mentioned to me about an adventure that Joseph had with another pastor in Mississippi when he was there. There were people that weren't too happy that they were working. First of all, there was a lot of animosity against the Morning Star mission that was there. They didn't want them to teach blacks to read. They didn't want them to have any kind of progress. And so he was a part of that. And so he was encouraging people to join, to learn about God and to join the church and learn to read and all of that kind of thing. And the pushback that he got was that the KKK was going to get him one night. And so he and this other pastor, I suspect it might have been G.E. Peters that was working with him, they jumped in a car at dark dusk and went the old back rum runners roads. The moonshiners had these back roads that they were evading the police with, and they used those roads and drove those roads to get across the state line. And going across to Alabama may not have been the safest thing, but it was at least better than staying there in Mississippi and being found and being done who knows what. So that to me was a key story in some of the struggles that he had in his and this is the beginning of his ministry. This was the time period where he had just come out of school and was doing that. So the other thing that I do want to mention and related to what Janice was saying is that a high point in his career was after he had brought his mother over, Christmas Day, 1937, he baptized her. She decided that she was going to join the church that he'd talked about all these years. And it may have been, as you were saying, Janice, that she realized and recognized he's been telling me the truth all this time.
He's been telling her the truth, but I also think she, from what I understand, it was when she really understood who her son had become.
Okay.
And that was like a mother's gift of validation to her son.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's so rich. So, all right, I am going to finish up. There are a couple of things that I think you should also know about. Oh, go ahead, Janice.
Just one thing. If anybody does have any questions and just not thinking about it or whatever, I put my website in the chat. So anybody can. How does it make you know? How does it make you feel knowing that your ancestors played such a prominent role in St. Kitts? When I get questions like that, I have mixed feelings about how to answer it. Because yes, I think that our family was fortunate, and on both sides of my family, we were fortunate. When I went to St. Kitts to do for the government, I went to the archive, and at that point, the archive was in total disarray because it had been right after the hurricane, and they were just scrambling to save everything they could. And they had like this pass line of just saving things as the water was rising, and they got things to higher ground and in a cinder block building where things were. And somehow, miraculously, I just knew that it has to be said, I was meant to find them. But as I was going through these newspapers, I just picked up a random stack out of order, but I found in it an ad about a concert that my other grandfather was performing in. And I showed it to the archivist, and she said, "Oh my goodness, so your family was white. Your grandfather was white." And I said, "No, he was black, and the whole family was black." And she said, "But my God, can you beat that?" And, so often we just don't know who we are, not only as a family, but as a people. And so, yes, I feel very privileged to have had the family that we have, but at the same point, I feel the obligation to be very grateful for all the families that we all have. We just don't know all the things that our ancestors, whether named or unnamed, went through so that we could be here. And people will say to me, well, yes, you're a historian, but why do you love history so? And I say, because how could we not look at all of this and feel something about who we are in this time in which we're operating? I mean, as hard as things are for us, we literally are the promises those people made to themselves, and we're their dreams. So I just see our family as representative of the greater whole.
That's one of those I would. Yes. Awesome. Okay, I see. I'm not sure. I don't see any other questions just yet, but if you have them, if you would scoot them in really quickly. And I'm going to mention there's so much more to Joseph Hermes' story. And one of the things that I found fascinating in meeting some of the people that owed their existence in this particular church to him, they would come up to me and say, "Oh, your grandfather baptized me, and I'm still in the church." And this, these were really older individuals, and they felt it was important to let me know about that, not just to say, "Oh, this is your grandfather," but they were just so appreciative of what he had done for them, how he had educated them, how he had allowed them to find new vistas in their own lives. And they were so glad that they could actually say something, because some of them did not get to see him ever again, but they got to tell me. And so that was I mean, there is a list I can mention. Some of you might recognize some of these names. There is Milton Young, O.B. Edwards, Louis Bland and Frank Bland, Frank Peterson, who became president of Oakwood later on. And there was a Mr. Winston, whose son Joseph P. Winston, and grandsons William Winston, who is currently president of South Atlantic Conference, and Dr. Alvin Kibble was another one of the grandsons. He baptized that family. He also baptized Calvin, the parents of Calvin Mosley. He baptized the family of Charles Dudley and his future wife, Etta Maycock. And these people have become leaders, presidents, administrators in the church, and they were responsible. He was responsible for bringing them into an arena where they could meet their purpose in life. He worked almost all of his life. There's another anecdote I'd like to share where he was in his 90s, probably around the time where he shouldn't have been driving. And his conference president was telling him, "Okay, now when are you going to retire?" So he said, "Okay, I'll race you to the end of the corner. If you win, I'll retire." The gentleman said, "That's okay." That's all right. Because one of the things that he was known for was being healthy, preaching how to be healthy, and living healthfully. He used to, he would flip we would look at him like it was funny when he would come to visit, but he would flip and have his dinner first in the morning and then have his lighter meals later on. He would exercise all the time. He would do his push-ups, he would do his steps, he would do everything. And sometimes when he was preaching, he would kick up his legs. "See, I can still do this because I'm eating healthfully." And yes, he was vegetarian from, I think, the time he came to the United States.
He says that in his letter, yes.
So, he was determined to practice what he preached. The other thing that he was known for, he built so many new churches because he was assigned by his supervisors to go into places they called dark counties. These were places that had no churches. He would go in, knock door to door to door to door to door, and invite people and engage people, and not long after that, you would see that there was a church in that location. And so they would move him along to another place to do the same thing, because they said, "Well, if you're good at this, well, let's let somebody else just, nurture, and you go build another church." He has also, you mentioned his broadcast. I was really stunned to go through some records and recognize that in the 1940s, he had a major presence in the local newspapers. They had a place, and some newspapers still do, but most don't. But there was a place where all the churches would list their events. He made sure that was listed. I need to share this picture. Let me see if I can get to that really quickly. And I don't see where I put it. Oh, there it is. You see let me see if I can make that bigger so that it's
The microphones?
visible. You see the microphone with the call letters on there. He was broadcasting his church service. These people behind him were graduates of his Bible course. And every church service, he was broadcasting. This is in Cleveland, Ohio, where this picture is taking place, but he did that. I remember when we went to visit him in Seattle, that he was broadcasting there. And so he had my mother sing on the radio broadcast. He also played the trumpet and the piano. So if there was not somebody to do either, provide music, he'd provide his own. So he was just an amazing individual. At that Glenville church, one of the people he baptized there was T. Marshall Kelly and his family, who still is in his 90s and is still singing wonderfully. I just want to wrap up with this idea that the hallmarks of his ministry were his clarity of teaching biblical prophecy, establishing church schools at every major city church that he went. He established a Adventist church school in that area, most of whom are still functioning to this day. He developed a church's print and broadcast media presence wherever he went. And the attention to and the practice of the health message, that's what he was known for. He was a gifted communicator whose onstage presence was nonstop, visually engaging, and totally absorbing. He was most known for his health practices, and having inspired and baptized hundreds, and it could be thousands, but we're going to at least say hundreds of believers because of the time period where it was. He passed to his rest in September of 1987, surrounded by his wife and family, oldest daughter, Genevieve, whose daughter is actually on here with us this evening. And this, again, is a Black story that needs to be heard. And it is an inspiring story to recognize that you can overcome difficulties. You can become your best person, your best you. Should you focus on making sure that you are bringing everybody else with you. And so I am going to end my section right here. If there are any other questions, we would be happy to entertain them. And Pastor Leggett, I do believe you were going to come on to wrap up.
Oh, okay. Wow. Kerri, anybody else on here, what Chuck, your husband and I have attempted to do in terms of chronicling history. I think we've done, as a church, a poor job telling the history.
Pastor, I'm going to pause you. I'm going to pause you for just a moment because I can't hear you.
Can't hear me?
No.
Hold on.
And while you're doing that, I do see a question that said, how much did his roots play in the way that he gave his service to the community in the USA? Does anybody have a...
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, now I can hear you.
All right, good, good, good. I was saying, you know better than most on here what your husband and I have attempted to do in terms of chronicling the history of the pioneers of the Black work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I think we've done, I think, unfortunately, we are very late in coming to it. But fortunately enough, we have captured some of those stories of those individuals before they passed on. If you go to my website, Frankly Speaking, a biblical perspective, you'll see right now an interview by the very first Hebrew and Greek teacher at Oakwood, Dr. E.E. Rogers. You'll see the interview by Elder Fred Crow, the very first treasurer for the very first regional conference in the work, Black conference in the work. And so I think, and you know, it's interesting that you said, and I was thinking it as I'm hearing all of this incredible history, none of which I even knew. I mean, I heard the name J.H. Lawrence, but I didn't know what that stood for. I didn't know all that he had done. I didn't know all that he had meant. I knew he was a great evangelist, but that's all I knew. I didn't know any specific details. We've got to tell this story. We have got to tell this story. I am not going to the grave by the grace of God until I get this story on camera, because the tragedy is that our children and grandchildren, and maybe soon to be great grandchildren, because now I got grandkids in the 20s, don't know any of this history. If I don't know about J.H. Lawrence, there's a snowball's chance in Hades that my children and grandchildren don't know about J.H. Lawrence. And that's a tragedy. That is a tragedy. And so we have to do a better job. You know, it's been said, it's a cliche, but it is absolutely true. You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from. Right? You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you come from. And you are duty bound to repeat history if you don't know what history was, what you've experienced in the past. We've got to capture the story. This has to go at the very top of the list. And I am committing myself to capturing the stories of a J.H. Lawrence and E.E. Cleveland, a C.E. Dudley, C.E. Mosey, all of these, and C.T. Richards. Oh my gosh, one of the godliest men I've ever met in my life. Nobody has these stories. Nobody's telling these stories. We've got to capture this. And I'm going to dedicate myself to making sure that we get these stories and we pass them on to the younger generations coming up behind us. I'm absolutely committed to this. So I want to thank all of you. What was your cousin's name? Elder Richard's daughter. What's her name? What's her name, Kerri? What's your cousin's name?
My name is Carmen, sir.
Carmen. I want to thank Carmen for just letting me see her face. I am so grateful just to see that face again. That is the face of Clarence T. Richards, if there ever was one. Boy, this is a walk down memory lane that I shall never forget. Absolutely, positively. So I'm sorry.
I'm glad. I'm so
Absolutely.
happy I've made you happy.
Absolutely.
And I'm delighted to see Cousin Janice. Delighted, always.
Good to see you, Carmen.
So So to Kerri and Dr. Janice Adams and to cousin Carmen and to Alexia and to everybody that has played a part in this day, I so thank you. We are so blessed. And I want to thank P and all of the staff that works very, 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 very hard to do what we do, because it's our conclusion that prior to us doing this, I guess this is like the 5th or 6th year we're doing it now. You know, before then, we were just doing, you know, African-American history, like especially first Sabbath of the month, you know, and we were just going over that history as if no other Black people anywhere else in the world had a story to tell but us, as if no other Black people anywhere else in the world had a struggle for freedom and equality and independence. And so we, you know, we shifted our focus, and every Sabbath we are focusing on a different country, and every Sabbath is absolutely unique. It is absolutely rich. And we are being educated about our struggles as a people all over the globe. And I am so grateful to the committee for all of their dedication and commitment. Next Sabbath, we shine a spotlight on Trinidad and Tobago. And then after that, the 4th Sabbath, our final Sabbath for the month, we shine a spotlight on Kenya. So we're going to have an awesome time just educating ourselves about our people. Literally we're literally all over the globe. And so I want to thank all of you. It's been an awesome day.
I'm sorry. I'm missing a cousin. She didn't have her camera on, but there's another cousin that's with us. Margaret Whitlock, can you open your camera, please? Thank you. And her dad was Hermanos. She was named after Uncle Hermie.
Okay. Awesome. Well, look, I want to thank all of you. What a privilege and an honor this was to have all of you come on and share your rich and incredible history with us. It truly has been a blessing. Amen. Amen. Let us conclude with a word of prayer. Father God, I thank you. I thank you, Lord, that in spite of the struggle that we've had all over the globe, in spite of the injustices, the lynchings, the enslavement, and all of that, you have never abandoned us as a people, because you said, I will not leave you nor forsake you. And we have taken you at your word, and you have not failed us. So I thank you. I'm grateful for everyone who has come on today and shared their rich history from St. Kitts and Nevis. Information we had not been privy to before, but now we know it and we're grateful for it. Be with us throughout the rest of this day. Bless us throughout the rest of the week as we prepare for our next spotlight on Trinidad and Tobago. Continue to bless us, guide us, keep us, protect us. And if we should not meet again on this side of the kingdom, maybe, just maybe, we should have a St. Kitts and Nevis day in heaven above, and we can meet, and I'm including myself in that, obviously, but we can meet at the Tree of Life and celebrate the fact that we made it over, all of us. Bless us, guide us, keep us, direct us, and then save us when you come. In Jesus' name I ask it. For his sake I pray. Amen. 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 So look, I'm gonna see all of y'all at the Tree of Life, St. Kitts and Nevis Day. I'm gonna crash the party. I'm not from there, but I'm crashing the party. Just make sure you have some mangoes, and I'm certainly gonna show up. I'm crashing the party. I'm telling you right now, So thank you for this. This has been awesome. I appreciate every one of you. Amen.
All right, are we clear?
You are my strength.
Now we're clear.
Now we're clear.
Strength